When Michael moved in next door, I thought nothing of it. He was polite, maybe a little too charming for his own good, but harmless. Lauren, my wife, was thrilled to have someone new in the neighborhood. "He's so friendly," she said over dinner one night. "It's nice to have someone who actually says hello and isn't glued to their phone all the time." I nodded, agreeing half-heartedly. I wasn't the sociable type, but Lauren always had a knack for connecting with people. Michael was in his mid-30s, tall, with an easy smile that seemed to disarm everyone he met. He worked from home, or so he claimed, which meant he was always around. I'd see him out in his yard, shirtless under the summer sun, tinkering with his motorcycle or chatting with the other neighbors. Lauren would wave to him from our kitchen window, and he'd wave back with that same effortless charm. At first, I didn't think much of it. Lauren had always been friendly with our neighbors, and it wasn't like she was hiding anything. If anything, she seemed happier lately, more energetic, more engaged. She started baking again, something she hadn't done in years, and our house was filled with the smell of cookies and fresh bread. "You're in a good mood lately," I said one evening as we sat on the couch. She shrugged, smiling. "I guess I'm just enjoying life. It feels nice to have a little change, you know?" I didn't press her on it. Why would I? Things between us were fine. At least, I thought they were. But then little things started to add up. It began with her schedule. Lauren had always been predictable, a creature of habit. But now, there were unexplained gaps in her day. She'd say she was going to the store, and come back 2 hours later with only a bag of groceries. When I asked where she'd been, she'd laugh and say, "You know how I get distracted. I ran into someone and got to talking." Then there were the late-night texts. She'd sit on the couch with her phone in her lap, the screen lighting up every few minutes. When I asked who she was texting, she'd wave it off. "Just the girls," she'd say, her tone dismissive. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the unease in my gut was growing. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid. After all, Lauren wasn't the type to keep secrets. She'd always been open, honest, and kind. But the more I tried to convince myself, the less certain I felt. The final straw came one Saturday afternoon. I was working in the garage when I heard laughter drifting over from the backyard. Peering out the window, I saw Lauren standing at the fence, talking to Michael. She was smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years, her head tilted back as she laughed at something he'd said. He leaned against the fence, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on her like she was the only person in the world. I stepped outside, forcing myself to stay calm as I approached them. "Hey," I said, my voice even. Lauren turned to me, her smile faltering just slightly. "Hey, honey," she said, her tone bright but a little too quick. "We were just talking about the neighborhood. Michael's trying to figure out the best place to take his dog for a walk." Michael grinned, nodding at me. "Your wife's been really helpful. You're lucky to have someone so friendly." I forced a smile, but my jaw tightened. "Yeah," I said, "she's great." As the three of us stood there, the air between Lauren and Michael felt charged, like there was an unspoken connection I wasn't supposed to notice. My stomach twisted, but I said nothing. Instead, I made an excuse to go back inside, leaving them alone by the fence. Later that night, as I lay in bed beside Lauren, I stared at the ceiling, the knot in my stomach tightening. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was overreacting. But the doubt had already taken root, and I knew I couldn't ignore it forever. The unease didn't fade, it grew. Every little moment seemed to add fuel to the fire, even though I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Lauren wasn't secretive by nature, and I had never had a reason to doubt her before. But lately, her behavior felt off. Like the other night, when I caught her coming inside with her phone in hand. It was late, close to midnight, and I was in the living room reading when I heard the back door creak open. I glanced up to see Lauren slipping in quietly, like she was hoping I wouldn't notice. Her phone was clutched tightly in her hand, the glow of the screen illuminating her face as she tapped out a message. "You're up late," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. She jumped slightly, looking up at me with wide eyes before recovering with a soft laugh. "You scared me," she said, slipping her phone into the pocket of her robe. "I was just checking on something outside." "Checking on what?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. The plants, she said quickly, gesturing vaguely toward the backyard. I thought I left the garden hose on. It wasn't a convincing lie, but I didn't push it. Instead, I just nodded and went back to my book, though I didn't absorb a single word after that. The next day, I decided to clear my head. Maybe some time away from the house would help me put things into perspective. I packed the kids into the car and took them to the park, giving Lauren the day to herself. It was a perfect afternoon, sunny and warm, the kind of day that makes you feel like everything might just be okay. The kids laughed and played on the swings while I sat on a bench, watching them and trying to shake the growing knot in my stomach. But when we got home, I noticed something strange. Michael's truck was parked in his driveway, but he wasn't in his yard like usual. The house was quiet. No sign of him tinkering with his motorcycle or chatting with the neighbors. As I pulled into our driveway, I saw Lauren standing at the kitchen window. She waved at us with a bright smile, but something about the way she moved seemed nervous. Later that evening, I found myself sitting in the garage, pretending to fix the lawnmower but really just trying to think. The day hadn't done anything to ease my doubts. If anything, it had made them worse. Every time I saw Lauren and Michael, it felt like there was something just beneath the surface, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I started to notice other things, too. Lauren was on her phone more often, always tilting the screen away from me when I walked into the room. She started dressing up more, even for small errands, wearing clothes I hadn't seen her pull out of the closet in years. And there were the quiet moments, the times I'd catch her staring off into space with a faint smile on her lips, like she was lost in a thought she wasn't going to share with me. One evening, I came home earlier than usual. I'd finished a meeting ahead of schedule and decided to skip the rest of the day, hoping to surprise Lauren. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Michael's truck was gone. Relief washed over me. At least I wouldn't have to see him lounging in his yard, flashing that infuriating grin. But when I walked inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The kids weren't home. They were still at a friend's house, and Lauren wasn't in the kitchen like she usually was around this time. I set my bag down and called out her name, but there was no answer. That's when I heard it. Faint laughter coming from upstairs. My chest tightened as I climbed the stairs, the sound growing louder with each step. It was Lauren's voice, unmistakable, but it was joined by another, a man's voice, low and smooth. My heart was pounding by the time I reached the top of the stairs. The laughter was coming from our bedroom. I froze outside the door, my hand hovering over the handle. For a moment, I considered walking away, pretending I hadn't heard anything. But the knot in my stomach had grown into something unbearable, something I couldn't ignore anymore. I pushed the door open, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The door creaked as it swung open, and the room came into view. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears, and for a moment, I thought maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I'd find nothing, and this would all turn out to be some cruel joke my mind had been playing on me. But there was no mistaking what I saw. Lauren was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hair tousled and her face flushed. Michael was beside her, leaning back casually like he belonged there. They both froze when they saw me, their expressions shifting from surprise to something far more uncomfortable. Michael was the first to recover, standing and offering me that infuriatingly calm smile. "Hey, Mark," he said, his tone casual, as if this were the most normal situation in the world. "Didn't expect you home so early." I stared at him, my mind racing. Lauren's face had turned pale, her hands gripping the edge of the bed like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. "What's going on here?" I asked, my voice low and steady, though I could feel the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Michael shrugged, his calm demeanor only making my fists clench tighter. "Just talking," he said. "Lauren and I were catching up on some things." "Catching up," I repeated, my jaw tightening. I looked at Lauren, my eyes searching hers for some kind of explanation, but she wouldn't meet my gaze. "Is that what this is, Lauren? Just catching up?" She finally found her voice, though it was barely above a whisper. "Mark, it's not what it looks like." "Then tell me what it is," I said, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. "Because from where I'm standing, it doesn't look good." Michael held up his hands, taking a step back. Hey man, I think I should go. This is between you two. You're damn right it's between us, I snapped, my glare shifting to him. And you've got no business being here. He nodded, his smile finally slipping as he grabbed his jacket from the chair and headed for the door. I'll see you around, he said, his tone far too casual for the situation. As the door clicked shut behind him, I turned back to Lauren, my anger barely contained. Start talking, I said, crossing my arms over my chest. She looked down at her hands, her shoulders slumping as she let out a shaky breath. It's not what you think, she said again, her voice trembling. Then tell me what it is, I demanded. She hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. Michael's been going through some things, she said finally. He needed someone to talk to, and I was just trying to help. By bringing him into our bedroom? I shot back, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Do you have any idea how this looks, Lauren? How it feels to walk in and see you sitting here with him like this? Tears filled her eyes, but I wasn't in the mood to feel sorry for her. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean for it to look that way. But it did, I said, my voice hard. And I need to know why. Why is he here, Lauren? Why is he always around? Why do you spend so much time with him? She shook her head, tears spilling over as she tried to find the words. I don't know, she said, her voice breaking. He listens, Mark. He makes me feel like someone actually cares about what I have to say. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. And I don't? I asked, my voice quiet but filled with hurt. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with panic. That's not what I meant, she said quickly. You do, Mark. You do. But things have been so distant between us lately, and I guess I don't know. I'm sorry. Her apology felt hollow, like it was meant to end the conversation rather than address the real issue. I stared at her for a long moment, my chest tight with a mix of anger, hurt, and betrayal. I can't do this right now, I said finally, turning and walking out of the room before she could say anything else. As I sat in the living room, my head in my hands, I tried to make sense of everything. Her words replayed in my mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. She felt distant. She felt like I didn't care. And instead of talking to me about it, she turned to him. The knot in my stomach tightened as I realized something. This wasn't just about Michael. This was about us, about the cracks in our marriage that I'd been too blind to see. But knowing that didn't make it hurt any less. The silence in the house after the confrontation was deafening. Lauren stayed upstairs, and I sat alone in the living room, my thoughts spiraling. Every word she'd said replayed in my mind, but none of it made sense. He listens to me. He makes me feel like someone cares. How had we gotten to this point? Was it really about me not listening? Or was it something else entirely? Something deeper that I hadn't seen coming? I couldn't stay in that house. The walls felt like they were closing in, suffocating me. Grabbing my keys, I headed out, needing air, needing distance. I drove without a destination, the familiar streets blurring together as I wrestled with my emotions. Part of me wanted to scream, to punch the steering wheel until my knuckles bled. The other part of me wanted to cry, to let the pain wash over me and drown me. But I did neither. Instead, I just drove, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the stillness. Eventually, I found myself at a small diner on the outskirts of town. It was nearly empty, the kind of place where no one asked questions. I slid into a booth, ordered a coffee I didn't want, and stared at the swirling patterns in the tabletop. The confrontation had left me rattled, but more than that, it had left me with questions I couldn't ignore. Was this really the first time? Or had there been others? And why Michael? Of all people, why him? As I sat there, lost in thought, my phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Lauren. Please come home. We need to talk. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. What was there to say? That I was ready to hear more half-truths and excuses? That I wanted to sit across from her and pretend everything was fine? No, I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. By the time I got home, it was late. The house was dark, and Lauren had left the bedroom door ajar, as if she were waiting for me to come in. I didn't. I went straight to the guest room, closing the door behind me and locking it. For the first time in years, I felt like a stranger in my own home. The next morning, I decided to take a different approach. If Lauren wasn't going to be honest with me, then I'd find the answers myself. She'd left her phone on the kitchen counter, and I knew this was my chance. My hands shook as I picked it up, scrolling through her messages. Most of them were innocent, texts from her coworkers, a group chat with her friends, reminders about the kids' schedules. But then I saw his name, Michael. My stomach twisted as I opened the thread. At first, it was nothing unusual, brief exchanges about the neighborhood, questions about the kids. But as I scrolled further back, the tone shifted. The messages became more frequent, more personal. There were jokes, inside references I didn't understand, and compliments that felt too intimate to be casual. And then there was one message that made my breath catch. Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about it. Lauren's reply was immediate. Me too. You always know how to make me smile. My chest tightened, and I felt the blood rush to my head. This wasn't just a friendship. This was something deeper, something that crossed every line we'd ever drawn in our marriage. My hands shook as I took screenshots, forwarding them to my own phone. I needed evidence, proof that I wasn't imagining things, that this wasn't just paranoia. When Lauren came downstairs later that morning, she acted like everything was normal. "Do you want coffee?" she asked, her voice light, as if nothing had happened the night before. I looked at her, my stomach churning with a mix of anger and sadness. "No," I said flatly, turning away from her and heading toward the door. "Mark," she called after me, her tone shifting. "Are you okay?" I stopped in my tracks, my hand on the doorknob. "Am I okay?" I repeated, my voice colder than I intended. "No, Lauren, I'm not okay." Before she could respond, I walked out, slamming the door behind me. I couldn't stay there, not with her acting like everything was fine. I needed space, and more than that, I needed a plan. This wasn't just about confronting her anymore. This was about figuring out what came next. I spent the rest of the day driving aimlessly, trying to sort through the chaos in my mind. The messages I'd read kept replaying over and over, the words cutting deeper each time. Last night was amazing. What had happened last night? Was it while I was working late? While I was out taking care of the kids? The betrayal was like a splinter I couldn't remove, small but excruciating, and it was burrowing deeper into me with every thought. Eventually, I pulled into a quiet park on the edge of town. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the empty playground. I sat on a bench, staring at nothing, and wondered what the hell I was supposed to do now. I had the proof that Lauren and Michael's relationship wasn't as innocent as she claimed. But what was my next move? Do I confront her? Do I pack my bags and leave? Or do I try to salvage what's left of our marriage? The idea of leaving felt like a punch to the gut. We'd built a life together, a family, a home. The kids needed both of us, and I couldn't imagine tearing their world apart because of this. But staying? Staying felt like swallowing glass. How could I look at Lauren and not see the lies? How could I sit at the same table, sleep in the same bed, knowing she'd chosen him over me? My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was a text from Lauren. "Where are you?" "I'm worried." I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to let her sit with her worry, but I knew that wouldn't solve anything. After a moment, I typed back, "I just need some time to think." Her reply came almost immediately. "Please come home. We can talk about this. I'll explain everything." The words made my stomach churn. Explain everything? What was left to explain? The messages were as clear as they could be. Still, I didn't respond. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and stayed on the bench until the sky turned dark. When I finally went home, the house was quiet. The kids were already asleep, and Lauren was sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for me. Her hands were wrapped around a mug of tea, and her face was pale and drawn. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes red and puffy. "Mark," she said softly, standing as I closed the door. I held up a hand, stopping her before she could say anything else. "Don't," I said. "Not right now." She nodded, sinking back into her chair. I walked past her, heading straight to the guest room. I could feel her eyes on me as I went, but I didn't look back. The next morning, I woke up early, unable to sleep any longer. I sat in the guest room, staring at the wall and wondering how we'd gotten here. The messages, the late nights, the laughter at the fence, it all pointed to something deeper than I wanted to admit. But the question I couldn't stop asking myself was why? Why would she risk everything we'd built for someone like Michael? I decided I needed answers. Real answers, not the vague half-truths she'd been giving me. When Lauren came downstairs that morning, I was waiting for her in the kitchen. "We need to talk," I said, my tone firm. She hesitated, her hand tightening around her coffee mug. "Okay," she said quietly, sitting down across from me. I pulled out my phone and set it on the table, the screenshots of the messages already open. "I know," I said, sliding the phone toward her. "I know about the messages. I know about you and Michael." Her face went pale as she stared at the screen, her hands trembling slightly. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, and I could feel my anger rising. "Say something," I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. She looked up at me, tears filling her eyes. "Mark, I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "Didn't mean for what to happen?" I asked, leaning forward. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you meant every word you said to him." She shook her head, wiping at her tears. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said, her voice trembling. "It started out as just talking. He was going through a tough time, and I wanted to help. But then things got complicated." "Complicated?" I repeated, my voice cold. "You mean you started sneaking around behind my back? Is that what you call complicated?" Her tears spilled over, and she buried her face in her hands. "I didn't want to hurt you," she said, her voice muffled. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Well, congratulations," I said bitterly. "Because you did. You didn't just hurt me, Lauren. You broke us." Lauren's tears fell freely now, her face buried in her hands as her shoulders shook. I wanted to feel something, anger, sorrow, pity, but all I felt was a cold, hollow numbness. I stared at her, my mind churning with everything she just admitted, and yet I still didn't have the answers I needed. "Why?" I asked, my voice low but firm. "Why him? Why Michael?" She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "I don't know," she said, shaking her head. "I wish I could explain it, but I don't have a good answer. He was there. He listened to me, made me feel seen, and I guess I got caught up in it." "Caught up in it?" I repeated, my jaw tightening. "You mean you threw away everything we built, our marriage, our family, because you felt seen by some guy who fixes motorcycles in his driveway?" "It wasn't like that," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "I wasn't thinking about the consequences. I wasn't thinking about what I was risking. I was selfish, Mark, and I hate myself for it." "You should," I snapped, my anger finally breaking through the numbness. "You should hate yourself, Lauren, because I hate what you've done. I hate that you've turned our life into this." She flinched at my words, her tears spilling over again. "I know," she whispered. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I swear, Mark, it wasn't physical. It was just emotional." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Emotional? Do you think that makes it better? Do you think that hurts less? Because let me tell you something, Lauren, it doesn't. It doesn't matter if you slept with him or not. The fact that you let him into our life, into our marriage, is enough." She reached across the table, her hand trembling as she tried to touch mine. I pulled back, the thought of her touch making my skin crawl. "Please, Mark," she said, her voice breaking. "I'll do anything to make this right. Just tell me what to do." "You can't make this right," I said coldly. "There's no magic fix for what you've done. The trust is gone, Lauren. And once it's gone, it's gone." Her sobs grew louder, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the messages, the laughter at the fence, the way she'd looked at him like he was the center of her world. And any sympathy I might have felt evaporated. "I need time," I said finally, standing up from the table. "I need space to figure out what the hell I'm going to do next." "Mark," she pleaded, standing up too. "Don't walk away. Please. We can fix this." We can go to counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. I turned to face her, my expression hard. You had a chance to fix this, Lauren. You had a chance to talk to me, to tell me what you were feeling. But instead, you chose him. And now we're here. Without another word, I grabbed my keys and walked out the door. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house. Not right now. The walls felt too small, too suffocating, and I needed air. I ended up driving to a friend's house, someone I hadn't seen in years, but who I knew I could trust. Jason had been my best man at our wedding, but life had pulled us in different directions. Still, when I knocked on his door, he opened it with a look of surprise that quickly turned to concern. "Mark," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "What's going on? You look like hell." "I need a place to crash," I said, my voice flat. "Just for a few days." He nodded, his expression serious. "Of course. Come in." As I sat on his couch, explaining everything that had happened, Jason listened quietly, his brow furrowed. When I finished, he leaned back, letting out a low whistle. "Man, I don't even know what to say. That's a lot. Tell me about it," I said, running a hand through my hair. "I don't even know where to start." "Well," he said slowly, "it sounds like you've already started by leaving the house. That's a good first step. But what are you going to do now?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to forgive her, for the kid's sake. But the other part of me, I don't know if I can." Jason nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Look, man, I'm not going to tell you what to do. But whatever you decide, you need to make sure it's what's best for you, and for the kids. Don't let guilt or anger drive your decision. Take your time, figure out what you want, and go from there." I nodded, his words sinking in. He was right. I couldn't make a decision out of anger or guilt. I needed to think things through, to figure out what was best for me and the kids. And as much as I hated to admit it, that might take more time than I wanted to give. Jason's house became my refuge over the next few days. It wasn't much, a small 2-bedroom place with a couch that had definitely seen better days. But it was exactly what I needed. Jason gave me space when I needed it, and an ear when I wanted to talk. Most of the time, I just sat in silence, staring at my phone and wondering what was happening back at home. Lauren texted me constantly, messages ranging from apologies to pleas to come back. "I miss you. The kids are asking about you. Please, Mark. I'm so sorry. We can fix this." I read every message, but I didn't respond. I couldn't. Not yet. I needed time to clear my head, to figure out what I wanted, what I could live with. Jason tried to help, but even he didn't have the answers I needed. "Man," he said one night as we sat on his porch, beers in hand, "this kind of thing, it doesn't just go away. You're going to have to figure out if you can live with it or not. There's no in-between." "I know," I said, staring at the darkened street. "But how do I even begin to trust her again? How do I believe anything she says after this?" Jason shrugged. "Maybe you don't. Maybe you find a way to co-parent and move on. Or maybe you try to rebuild, brick by brick. Either way, it's not going to be easy." That night, I lay awake on his couch, staring at the ceiling and replaying Jason's words in my head. Brick by brick. Was that even possible? And if it was, did I have the energy, or the will, to do it? The next morning, I woke up to another text from Lauren. This one was different. "I told the kids you're staying at a friend's house for work, but they're starting to ask questions. I can't keep lying to them, Mark. Please come home so we can talk. Even if it's just for them." It hit me like a punch to the gut. The kids. I hadn't even thought about how this was affecting them. They didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this mess, to feel like their world was crumbling because of something they couldn't understand. I knew then that I couldn't stay away forever. That afternoon, I drove home. The house felt strange when I walked in, familiar but different, like I was seeing it through a new lens. Lauren was in the kitchen, her face lighting up when she saw me. "Mark," she said, her voice filled with relief. "You're back." "For now," I said, keeping my tone neutral. The kids ran into the room, their faces lighting up as they shouted, "Daddy!" They threw themselves into my arms, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something close to happiness. After dinner, Lauren and I sat down in the living room, the kids upstairs, and the house quiet. She looked at me, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Thank you for coming back," she said softly. "I didn't come back for you," I said, my voice steady. "I came back for them." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I understand, but I'm glad you're here. Mark, I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Counseling, therapy, whatever you need, I'll do it." I leaned back in the chair, studying her. "I don't know if this is something we can fix, Lauren. You broke something in me, in us, that I don't think can ever be the same again." "I know," she said quickly, her voice trembling, "but I'm willing to try. Even if it takes years, I'll wait. I'll do anything. Just please don't give up on us." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to believe her, to take her at her word and try to rebuild what we'd lost. But the other part of me, the part still raw from the betrayal, wondered if that was even possible. Finally, I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I'm not making any promises," I said. "I'll stay for the kids, and I'll go to counseling with you. But this is going to take time, Lauren. A lot of time." She nodded, her tears spilling over. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving us a chance." "I'm not giving us a chance," I said bluntly. "I'm giving them a chance. Don't forget that." Her face crumpled, but she didn't argue. Instead, she nodded again, wiping at her tears as I stood and walked out of the room. The days that followed were a strange mix of familiarity and tension. I was back in the house, but it didn't feel like home. Lauren kept her distance, careful not to push me, but I could feel her watching me, waiting for some sign that things might return to normal. The kids, on the other hand, were ecstatic to have me back. Their smiles and laughter were like a balm, even if the cracks beneath the surface of our family life still lingered. Lauren brought up counseling again 2 nights later. We were sitting in the living room after the kids had gone to bed, the silence between us thick and heavy. She cleared her throat, breaking the quiet. "I looked into some counseling options," she said hesitantly. "There's a couple in town that specializes in situations like ours. I thought we could try it, if you're ready." I stared at her for a moment, my mind turning over her words. Counseling, therapy. It sounded so clinical, like a bandage for a wound that went far deeper than any therapist could reach. But at the same time, I couldn't deny that we needed something. Some kind of structure, some kind of help. "Fine," I said finally. "Set it up." Her relief was palpable. "Thank you," she whispered. "I promise, I'll do whatever it takes." "Don't thank me yet," I said coldly. "This doesn't mean I've forgiven you. It just means I'm willing to try, for the kids." She nodded, her smile fading slightly, but she didn't argue. Instead, she picked up her phone and started making arrangements, her determination almost painful to watch. The first counseling session was awkward, to say the least. We sat in a small, dimly lit office, facing a middle-aged woman named Dr. Harper, who had the kind of calm, patient demeanor that made you feel like she'd seen it all. Lauren fidgeted beside me, her hands twisting in her lap, while I sat stiffly, my arms crossed over my chest. "Thank you both for coming," Dr. Harper began, her voice soft but steady. "I know this isn't easy, but the fact that you're both here is a good first step." I didn't respond, but Lauren nodded quickly. "We want to fix things," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Or at least, I do." Dr. Harper looked at me, her expression neutral. "And you, Mark? What do you hope to get out of this?" I hesitated, my jaw tightening. "I'm here for the kids," I said finally. "They deserve some kind of stability, even if it's just us pretending to hold it together for their sake." Lauren flinched at my words, but she didn't interrupt. Dr. Harper nodded thoughtfully. "It's not uncommon for couples to start counseling with different goals," she said. "But it's important that we're honest about what we want and what we're willing to work toward. Mark, can you tell me what you feel has brought you to this point?" I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. Where do I even start? The lies? The texts? The fact that I walked into my own bedroom and found my wife sitting with another man? My voice rose slightly, the anger bubbling to the surface despite my efforts to stay calm. Lauren's eyes filled with tears, but she stayed quiet, her head bowed. Dr. Harper held up a hand, her tone gentle but firm. Let's take it one step at a time. Mark, I can see that you're carrying a lot of anger right now, and that's completely valid. But if we're going to work through this, we need to focus on understanding, not just blame. Understanding? I repeated, my voice sharp. What's there to understand? She chose him over me. What else is there to say? Lauren finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't like that, Mark. I wasn't choosing him. I don't even know what I was doing. I was lost, and I made a terrible mistake. But I never stopped loving you. I scoffed, leaning back in my chair. You've got a funny way of showing it. Dr. Harper stepped in, steering the conversation back on track. Lauren, it's important that you take responsibility for your actions, but it's also important to explore why this happened. Not as an excuse, but as a way to understand the underlying issues in your relationship. Lauren nodded, wiping at her tears. I know, she said quietly. I know I messed up, and I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. Dr. Harper turned to me, her gaze steady. Mark, do you think you're open to exploring those issues? To figuring out if there's a path forward for your marriage? I hesitated, the weight of her question pressing down on me. I don't know, I admitted. I want to say yes, but I don't know if I can. That's okay, Dr. Harper said gently. It's a process, and it's not something that happens overnight. The fact that you're here, willing to try, is a step in the right direction. The session ended with no grand revelations, no sudden breakthroughs. But as we left the office, Lauren looked at me with a mixture of hope and fear. Thank you for coming, she said softly. It means a lot. I didn't respond, but I didn't pull away when she reached for my hand, either. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it felt like the first real step we'd taken towards something. Whether it was rebuilding or letting go, I still wasn't sure. The drive home from the counseling session was quiet. Lauren sat beside me, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. I could feel her glancing at me every so often, but I kept my eyes on the windshield, my mind too tangled to even begin a conversation. Dr. Harper's words replayed in my head. It's a process. The fact that you're here, willing to try, is a step in the right direction. But was I willing to try? That question lingered like a shadow. It was easy to sit in a chair and nod while a therapist talked about steps forward in rebuilding trust. But the actual work, the emotional toll of it, felt insurmountable. And what if we tried and failed? What if this crack in our marriage was too deep to mend? When we pulled into the driveway, Lauren broke the silence. Do you want to talk about it? She asked softly. I shook my head. Not right now. She nodded, her shoulders slumping as she got out of the car. I followed her inside, where the kids were waiting with wide smiles and eager hugs. For a moment, everything felt normal, almost. But as I watched Lauren laughing with them, her eyes bright and her smile genuine, I felt the weight of everything pressing down again. That night, after the kids were asleep, I found myself pacing the guest room, my thoughts racing. Lauren's apology during the session had sounded sincere, but sincerity wasn't enough. Trust didn't come back with a few heartfelt words. It had to be rebuilt brick by brick, as Jason had said, and I wasn't sure if I had the energy or the will to lay the first stone. I opened my phone and scrolled to the screenshots of the messages between her and Michael. My chest tightened as I read them again, each word a reminder of the betrayal. Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about it. The thought of her saying those things to someone else, of her sharing moments with him that should have been ours, made my stomach churn. The next day, Lauren asked me to join her for a walk. It was something we used to do all the time, back when things were simpler. I agreed reluctantly, and we set out on the trail near our house, the air crisp and the path lined with trees just starting to turn gold for autumn. For a while, we walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. Finally, Lauren spoke. Mark, I know I've said this 100 times, but I'm so sorry. I don't know if you'll ever believe me, but I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. I stopped walking, turning to face her. Do you even understand what you've done, Lauren? I asked, my voice quiet but sharp. Do you know what it feels like to be blindsided like this? To wake up one day and realize the person you thought you knew has been lying to you? Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't look away. I do understand, she said, her voice trembling, and I hate myself for it. I hate that I hurt you, that I broke something I don't know how to fix. But Mark, I swear to you, I will spend the rest of my life trying to make this right. Words aren't enough, I said bluntly. They never will be. You need to show me that you mean it. Because right now, all I see are empty promises. I know, she said, wiping her tears away. And I will. I'll do whatever it takes to prove it to you, even if it takes years. I don't want to lose you. I let out a long breath, my anger softening just slightly. Lauren, I'm here. I'm still in this house, and I'm still showing up for the kids. But I don't know if I can ever go back to the way things were. And I need you to understand that. She nodded, her expression solemn. I do. And I'll wait, Mark. For as long as it takes, I'll wait. The days that followed felt like a slow, unsteady march toward something I couldn't quite name. Lauren kept her distance unless it involved the kids, and I found myself drawn more into their world. Homework, soccer practice, bedtime stories. Their laughter and innocence were a stark contrast to the weight I carried, but being around them reminded me of what I was still fighting for. Lauren scheduled another counseling session, and I reluctantly agreed to go. It wasn't that I believed we'd find a magical solution sitting in that office, but I knew we had to keep trying, if only for the kids. The session was more of the same. Lauren apologizing, me expressing my anger and confusion, and Dr. Harper trying to guide us through the wreckage. Mark, Dr. Harper said at one point, her calm voice cutting through the silence. It seems like you're still processing a lot of anger, which is completely understandable. But do you feel like you're making any progress? Even small steps? I thought about it for a moment, then shrugged. I don't know, I admitted. Some days, I feel like maybe I can move past this. Other days, it feels impossible. That's normal, she said. Healing isn't a straight line. There will be setbacks, but what matters is that you're both here, willing to try. Lauren nodded quickly. I'll do whatever it takes, she said, her voice trembling. I just need him to know that I'm committed to fixing this. I hear you, Dr. Harper said gently, but it's important to remember that rebuilding trust takes time and consistent effort. Mark needs to see actions, not just hear words. After the session, Lauren asked if I wanted to grab a coffee before heading home. I hesitated, but something about her tone, hopeful yet hesitant, made me agree. We sat in a small cafe, the air filled with the scent of fresh pastries and the quiet hum of conversations around us. Thank you for coming to counseling, she said, breaking the silence. I know it's not easy, but it means a lot to me. I sipped my coffee, staring out the window. I'm doing it for the kids, I said bluntly. She nodded, her smile fading slightly. I know, but I hope one day it'll be for us too. I didn't respond, and the rest of the coffee was consumed in silence. That evening, I found myself in the garage, tinkering with an old toolbox. It wasn't about fixing anything. It was just an excuse to clear my head. The garage had always been my space, a place where I could think without interruption. Lauren came in after a while, standing quietly in the doorway. Mark, she said softly. I didn't look up. What is it? I wanted to thank you, she said, her voice trembling slightly. For staying. For trying. I turned to face her, leaning against the workbench. Lauren, I'm not staying because everything's fine. I'm staying because I don't want to rip this family apart. But that doesn't mean I've forgiven you. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. I know, she said, and I don't expect you to. Not yet. But I'm not giving up on us, Mark. I love you, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you if that's what it takes. I stared at her for a long moment, her words echoing in my mind. Part of me wanted to believe her, to believe that she could change, that we could somehow rebuild what we'd lost. But the other part of me, the part still raw and wounded, wasn't ready to let go of the pain. Finally, I sighed, running a hand through my hair. You've got a long road ahead of you, Lauren, I said quietly. If you're serious about fixing this, it's going to take more than words. It's going to take time and actions and a lot of patience. I know, she said, her voice breaking. And I'm ready for it. I nodded, turning back to the workbench. Then we'll see, I said. But don't mistake this for forgiveness. Not yet. Over the next few weeks, things started to feel different. Not better, necessarily, but different. Lauren threw herself into rebuilding our life, taking over more of the responsibilities at home, planning family outings, and making an effort to communicate with me in ways she hadn't before. She didn't push me, didn't demand answers, or try to rush the process. And I noticed. I noticed the way she smiled more around the kids, the way she stayed up late organizing the house, the way she seemed genuinely invested in trying to make things right. It didn't erase the hurt, but it made me think. One night, after the kids were asleep, I found myself standing outside our bedroom door. My bedroom door, technically, since Lauren had moved back into the guest room to give me space. I hesitated for a long moment, my hand hovering over the handle, before finally turning and walking away. I wasn't ready. Not yet. But for the first time in weeks, I thought that maybe, just maybe, I could be.